Judge Thomas Mitchell had spent his entire career navigating the labyrinth of laws and cases. The chaos of the city had defined his life for decades. But now, in his retirement, he longed for something simpler. A quiet life, away from the hustle, away from the courtroom. He dreamed of a place where the biggest worry was whether the grass needed mowing. A peaceful town where neighbors still greeted each other, where the sound of children playing filled the air, and the sunsets painted the sky in shades of orange and pink. A small town on the outskirts of the city seemed like the perfect place to put down his roots. He found it, Clearview Ridge. It was everything he had imagined, a tight-knit community where everyone knew each other by name, where time seemed to slow down. A place where Judge Mitchell could finally enjoy the fruits of his hard-earned career and live out his golden years in peace. But, as Thomas soon discovered, peace was fragile. It was only a matter of time before the cracks began to show, and the calm surface of Clearview Ridge began to splinter. It started with something small. A meeting of the neighborhood's homeowners association, HOA, which had always been a benign group of volunteers, began to grow in influence. At first, they made reasonable requests: keep your lawn tidy, respect the quiet hours, and be mindful of your neighbors. But then the rules became more frequent, more intrusive, and Thomas found himself growing wary. One morning, while sipping his coffee on his porch and watching the sunrise, he heard a frantic knock at the door. It was Martha, a longtime neighbor, her face flushed with panic. "Thomas, you need to see this," she said, grabbing his arm without waiting for a response. Her voice was shaking as she led him down the street. "It's those damn HOA people. They've gone too far this time." Thomas, now intrigued, followed her. His steps slowed as they approached the end of the road. His heart dropped when he saw it. Automatic bollards, metal barriers, had been installed at the only entrance to the neighborhood. At first, they seemed harmless, maybe even necessary. But Thomas knew better. This wasn't a simple security measure. It was something far more sinister. "They've done it to stop cars without HOA stickers from coming in," Martha said, her voice trembling with frustration. "But it's worse than that. They've locked us out too. Our friends, our families, they can't get in anymore." Thomas felt a cold dread wash over him. The road wasn't owned by the HOA. It was public property, maintained by the county. They had no right to block access to it. No right to control who entered or who didn't. This wasn't just a question of convenience. It was a violation of basic rights. But Thomas hadn't yet realized the full extent of what was happening. That would come the next day when he decided to confront Richard Palmer, the president of the HOA. Richard was everything Thomas despised: arrogant, smug, and far too comfortable with power. When Thomas walked into his office, Richard greeted him with a too casual smile. "Judge Mitchell, what can I do for you today?" Richard asked, leaning back in his chair as if the matter at hand was of no real importance. Thomas kept his tone calm but firm. "I need you to explain why you've installed these illegal barriers on a counter-maintained road. You don't have the authority to do that." Richard barely flinched. His smile never wavered. "We're just keeping the neighborhood safe. People were speeding. The board voted, and it's final. Safety." Thomas repeated, skepticism dripping from his voice. "This is public land. You don't have the right to block access to it, let alone charge people to get through." Richard's eyes flashed with irritation. "The board disagrees," he snapped. "Unless you're here to join the HOA, your opinion doesn't matter." That was the moment Thomas knew this wasn't just a matter of protecting the community. This was about power. And Richard Palmer wasn't about to let it go without a fight. The next day, as if on cue, Thomas's worst fears were realized. An ambulance approached the barriers, its sirens blaring as it sped toward the neighborhood. The driver slowed as he saw the bollards rise. He attempted to turn around, but the barriers had already gone up. With a sickening thud, the ambulance's bumper slammed into one of the metal posts. The driver cursed, visibly upset, as he radioed for backup. The damage had been done. Thomas watched from the side, his stomach twisting. It wasn't just a minor inconvenience anymore. This was putting lives at risk. Just moments later, he saw another car approaching, the car of a local teacher, Miss Elena Gray. She hadn't noticed the bollards rising until it was too late. Her tires shredded, the sound deafening as she slammed into the barriers. $33,000 in damages, she shouted, stepping out of her car, her voice laced with disbelief. "Who the hell do they think they are?" Thomas's blood ran cold. This wasn't about safety, it was about control. The HOA had crossed a line. They weren't just creating a hassle. They were creating chaos, all in the name of power. His mind raced as he pieced it all together. Richard Palmer and his board weren't just protecting the neighborhood, they were manipulating it, extorting money from the residents, and abusing their power to line their pockets. It was a game of control, and the stakes were far higher than he'd ever imagined. That night, Thomas sat at his desk, his mind focused on the task ahead. He couldn't let this go. Not this time. He had the knowledge and the tools to bring them down. This fight wasn't just about the neighborhood, it was about something much bigger, standing up to the corruption that had taken root in the community. As he dove into his research, he knew one thing for certain: the fight had only just begun. The weight of what had happened still lingered in Thomas's chest as he sat at his desk, the faint glow of his desk lamp casting shadows over the paperwork sprawled before him. The chaos of the previous day, the ambulance, Miss Gray's wrecked car, had left him unsettled, but it also solidified his resolve. Something had to be done. He couldn't let Richard Palmer and the HOA get away with this. The truth was clearer now. The HOA wasn't just out of control, they were actively exploiting their position for personal gain. The bollards, the fines, the arbitrary rules, it was all part of a larger plan to manipulate and dominate the community. They weren't concerned with safety, they were concerned with control. Thomas knew he had to gather evidence, something concrete, something irrefutable. He had been a judge for years. He understood the importance of facts in the pursuit of justice. Without hard proof, his concerns would just be dismissed as paranoia. He needed something that would expose the HOA's corruption once and for all. The next morning, he set out for the local courthouse, not to work on his own case but to dig into public records. He knew the neighborhood's road wasn't owned by the HOA, and he needed to confirm that for sure. He spent hours combing through county property records, cross-referencing information with his notes from the previous day. What he found made his blood boil. The road leading into the neighborhood was indeed public property, maintained by the county. The HOA had no legal right to install bollards, let alone charge people for access. The road wasn't theirs to control. Yet there they were, those metal barriers blocking entry. And they had the audacity to call it safety. But that wasn't all. Thomas moved on to the next part of his investigation, the HOA's complaints and fines. As he sifted through case after case, his frustration mounted. People were being fined for the smallest infractions. A weed here, an untidy lawn there. It didn't stop with lawn care, either. There were reports of residents being threatened with foreclosure for minor violations. Others had cars towed from public streets, cars that were parked legally. It was clear the HOA was running a racket. They were using fear to extort money from people. The worst part: most of these fines were arbitrary. The HOA was using them as leverage, not as a way to improve the neighborhood, but as a way to line their pockets. This was more than just a few bad apples. This was systemic corruption. That night, Thomas sat back, feeling the weight of what he had uncovered. He had the proof. He knew what the HOA was doing, but now he needed to expose it. He had to bring this to light. He had to take a stand, not just for himself but for the entire community. He spent the next few days preparing. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed help. He needed someone with authority, someone who could back him up when the time came. Sheriff David Lawson came to mind. He and Thomas had worked together on cases in the past, and Thomas trusted him. If anyone could help take down the HOA, it was David. That evening, Thomas made the call. "David, it's Thomas," he said, his voice steady but urgent. "I need your help." David's voice was low, but Thomas could hear the familiar authority in it. "What's going on, Thomas?" "I've got evidence," Thomas said, leaning forward in his chair, the weight of the situation sinking in. "The HOA. They're not just breaking the law, they're exploiting the entire neighborhood. I've got proof they're selectively blocking cars, charging fees, and fining people for things that shouldn't even be an issue. They're running an extortion racket, and it's time to bring them down." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then David spoke again. "I'm listening. Bring me what you've got, and we'll take care of the rest. You've got my word." The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Thomas reviewed his footage, ensuring it was watertight. He knew the HOA would try to weasel their way out of it, but the evidence didn't lie. He'd set up hidden cameras by the barriers and caught the HOA enforcers red-handed. He had footage of Kyle, Richard's right-hand man, adjusting the bollards manually, ensuring that only HOA-approved cars could pass. Non-HOA residents were blocked, trapped, forced to either turn around or pay a fine. It was a carefully orchestrated system of control. When Thomas finally met with David and handed over the footage, his heart raced. This was it. This was the moment everything would change. David watched the footage in silence, his eyes narrowing as the scenes played out before him. "This is worse than I thought," he muttered. "This isn't just a neighborhood dispute, Thomas. This is obstruction, extortion, and public endangerment." Thomas nodded grimly. "They've been getting away with this for too long. It's time to put a stop to it." David stood up, his face hardening with determination. "We'll take it from here. Get ready. The legal wheels are about to start turning." The following morning, deputies were dispatched, and the local news got wind of the story. As Thomas sat in his living room, watching the preparations unfold, he couldn't shake the feeling that the storm was about to hit. Richard Palmer and his enforcers wouldn't go down without a fight, and Thomas knew this wouldn't be easy. But for the first time in years, he felt like the weight of justice was on his side. The showdown was coming. And this time, Thomas wouldn't be backing down. Richard Palmer was already at the entrance when the deputies arrived. He stood there, his arms crossed, a smug smile plastered on his face, as if he were untouchable. The truth was about to unravel, and Thomas wasn't going to let him hide behind his authority any longer. Sheriff Lawson stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "Richard Palmer," he said, his eyes locking onto the HOA president, "you and your board are under investigation for illegal road obstruction, property damage, and extortion. You're breaking county laws, and this stops now." For a moment, Richard stood there, speechless. His smirk faltered. He opened his mouth to protest, but the words caught in his throat. He hadn't expected this. The crowd of neighbors gathered behind the sheriff began murmuring, their eyes wide with disbelief. The power the HOA had once held over them was slipping away. It was finally happening. Thomas stood in the background, watching the scene unfold. He could feel the tension in the air, the collective breath of the community waiting for the truth to be revealed. This was it. The battle for Clearview Ridge was just beginning, and Thomas Mitchell was ready to fight for the community he had come to love. The storm had arrived. The tension in the air was thick as Richard Palmer stood frozen in the face of Sheriff Lawson's announcement. The crowd, their faces a mixture of hope and disbelief, watched as the sheriff stepped forward, his deputies surrounding the area. For the first time in years, it felt like the power of the HOA was slipping, like the weight of their influence was no longer as unshakable as it had once been. Thomas stood just outside the circle, his hands clenched at his sides. He had never expected to feel this much satisfaction, watching the man who had terrorized the neighborhood for so long stand there, his confidence unraveling. It was as if the world had shifted on its axis. The fear that had once loomed over Clearview Ridge was slowly fading away, replaced by a quiet, almost surreal sense of freedom. Richard Palmer finally found his voice, but it came out in a strained, almost desperate tone. "You can't do this. This is our neighborhood. We've done everything by the book." Sheriff Lawson's expression remained unreadable. "By the book," he repeated, his voice cutting through the man's bluster. "You've been using that book to line your pockets, Mr. Palmer. You've been exploiting your neighbors, intimidating them with false charges and bogus fees. You've overstepped your bounds, and it's over." There was a moment of stunned silence, and then the whispers started, spreading like wildfire among the gathered neighbors. People were starting to believe it, to understand that the man who had been holding the reins of power for so long wasn't invincible after all. Thomas's heart pounded as he watched Richard's face contort in frustration. The HOA president's fists clenched as if he were about to lash out, but something in the sheriff's stance kept him rooted to the spot. The reality of the situation was sinking in. "You'll regret this," Richard spat, his voice dripping with venom. "You have no idea what you're up against. The HOA has resources, connections. You're just one man trying to bring down an entire system." Thomas took a step forward, his eyes locking with Richard's. The anger that had been building for months finally found its release. "The only system I see is one built on lies, intimidation, and greed. People have had enough. And I'm not alone in this." The crowd behind him murmured in agreement, and Thomas could feel the momentum building. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about everyone who had suffered under the oppressive rule of the HOA. People who had been silenced, ignored, or pushed into submission were finally standing up. Sheriff Lawson gave a nod to his deputies, signaling that it was time to make the arrest. Richard's expression morphed into one of disbelief, his arrogant facade crumbling under the weight of the truth. For a moment, it seemed like he might try to run, but a deputy was already at his side, handcuffing him with swift efficiency. The sight of Richard Palmer being led away in cuffs sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. Thomas couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but it was the beginning of something much bigger than any of them could have imagined. As the sheriff's deputies took Richard away, Thomas's phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a text message from David. The press is getting wind of this. It's about to hit the news. Be ready. Thomas's stomach tightened. He had been prepared for this moment, the fall of Richard Palmer, but he hadn't anticipated how quickly things would escalate. The media attention would bring more scrutiny, more eyes on Clearview Ridge. The battle was far from won, and the stakes had just been raised. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was an email from the local news station. Urgent. HOA president arrested on multiple charges. Neighborhood chaos or community victory? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Was this the beginning of something great, or would it only bring more strife to the neighborhood? Thomas didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing for certain. It was no longer just about the HOA. This was about justice, and he was ready to see it through. As the crowd began to disperse, murmuring excitedly about the arrest, Thomas took a deep breath. The winds of change were stirring, but he could feel a storm brewing on the horizon. There was no turning back now. As the news vans pulled up, their cameras flashing, he glanced over at Sheriff Lawson, who was now surrounded by reporters. The sheriff caught his eye and gave him a nod, a silent acknowledgement that this was only the beginning. The community's fight was far from over. Richard Palmer might have been taken down, but the forces behind him, those who had enabled the corruption, were still out there, lurking in the shadows. The real challenge lay ahead. But for now, Thomas allowed himself a brief moment of relief. He had done what he set out to do. He had taken a stand. The truth had come to light, and Clearview Ridge would never be the same again. The battle for justice had only just begun. And this time, Thomas wouldn't be fighting alone. The evening sky was streaked with a deep orange hue as the sun sank below the horizon. For the first time in months, Thomas allowed himself to exhale. Richard Palmer was gone, the HOA was in chaos, and the people of Clearview Ridge were standing together, ready to reclaim their neighborhood. But as the crowd began to disperse, and the news crews started to pack up, a feeling of unease lingered in Thomas's chest. This victory, as sweet as it was only the beginning. The sheriff's office had done its part, but the real work was just beginning. The news cycle would bring attention, sure, but it would also bring those who sought to undermine the movement. As the press interviewed residents, some spoke passionately about the injustices they had suffered. Others remained wary, still unsure whether the changes were truly for the better. The battle for the soul of Clearview Ridge wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, the local newspaper was filled with headlines about the HOA scandal, Richard Palmer's arrest, and the possible charges that could be leveled against the board. The shockwaves from the event rippled far beyond the borders of Clearview Ridge. In the weeks that followed, there were investigations, town hall meetings, and a renewed sense of hope among the residents. But there were also threats. Anonymous letters, phone calls, and rumors circulated about potential legal battles, about how powerful people with deep pockets could still try to protect their own. Thomas knew this wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew that the community's newfound strength would be the key to keeping the momentum alive. Richard Palmer and the others in the HOA weren't just fighting to save themselves, they were fighting to maintain a system that had brought them power and wealth at the expense of their neighbors. One night, as Thomas sat at his desk, going through the latest legal documents, he heard a knock on his door. He looked up to see Martha standing in the doorway, her face drawn and tired. She had been one of the most vocal opponents of the HOA, but tonight, something was different in her eyes. "They're not done, Thomas," she said quietly. "They're already regrouping. There are rumors of a new board, people who are just as dangerous as the old ones. They won't go quietly." Thomas sat back in his chair, staring at her for a long moment. He had suspected as much. Power, once tasted, was not easily relinquished. The fight was far from over, and the next battle would be against the systems that had allowed the HOA to operate unchecked for so long. Martha sighed, sitting down across from him. "We need a plan, Thomas. We can't just hope the law takes care of everything. If we're going to rebuild, we need to be vigilant. We need to keep fighting, not just for justice, but for the future of Clearview Ridge." Thomas nodded slowly, his mind already racing. They had taken down Richard Palmer, but the corruption ran deeper than just one man. The HOA was a symptom of a larger issue, a system that allowed a few to dominate, control, and manipulate. They had exposed the problem, but now they had to ensure it didn't rise again, stronger and more insidious. "We'll rebuild," Thomas said, his voice steady, but with an edge of resolve. We'll make sure that what happened here can never happen again. The next few weeks were a blur of action. The legal proceedings moved forward with Richard Palmer facing serious charges. The evidence Thomas had gathered was irrefutable, and soon, the corruption within the HOA began to unravel. Board members who had been complicit were questioned and arrested, and the ripple effect spread to other towns with similar HOA abuses. Clearview Ridge became a symbol of resistance, a community that had stood up and reclaimed its future. But the real turning point came during the town hall meeting that followed the dissolution of the HOA. The neighborhood had come together, united in their desire for change. Gone were the days of fear and suspicion. Gone were the petty rules and fines that had divided families. Now, people were looking at each other not as adversaries, but as neighbors, ready to rebuild together. Thomas stood at the front of the room, surrounded by familiar faces. Martha, his longtime ally, stood beside him, a quiet strength in her demeanor. The crowd was anxious. But there was also hope in the air, a tangible sense of possibility. This was their chance, not just to remove the bad, but to create something better. The fight isn't over, Thomas began, his voice carrying over the hushed crowd. But we've taken the first step. Together, we can rebuild Clearview Ridge into something that reflects the values we hold dear: community, respect, and fairness. We've learned that power doesn't belong in the hands of a few. It belongs to all of us. There was a murmur of agreement from the crowd, a spark of something new beginning to form in the hearts of the residents. We'll set up a new committee, Thomas continued, one made up of volunteers, people who actually live here. This won't be about control. This will be about cooperation. We'll establish new rules, ones that are fair and reasonable. Together, we'll decide what kind of community we want to be. The room erupted in applause. The residents of Clearview Ridge weren't just reacting to what had happened, they were taking ownership of their future. Months passed, and the community began to heal. New committees were formed, each focused on improving a different aspect of neighborhood life: safety, maintenance, and, most importantly, communication. Gone were the days of divisive, arbitrary rules. Instead, the focus shifted to building a stronger, more unified community. Thomas had never imagined this outcome when he first moved to Clearview Ridge. He had come here seeking peace, seeking to leave behind the chaos of his past. What he found was something far more valuable: a community that had learned the true meaning of unity, justice, and strength. As he walked through the neighborhood one evening, Thomas noticed something he hadn't seen in a long time: neighbors talking to each other, laughing together, sharing their experiences. The fear that had once held them captive was gone. They had reclaimed their home. And then, as if in answer to Martha's suggestion months ago, someone casually brought it up. What if we rename this road? Something fitting: Mitchell Lane, maybe. Thomas chuckled, shaking his head. I don't need the recognition, he said. But deep down, he knew the gesture wasn't about him. It was about the community they had saved. The neighborhood had found its voice, and they had used it to change their world. That night, as he sat on his porch, watching the stars appear in the clear sky, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace. The battle for justice had been hard fought, but it had been worth it. And Clearview Ridge was finally free. The neighborhood had won, and so had he. The lessons they had learned, about standing up for what was right, about the power of unity, and about never letting fear dictate their future, would live on for generations to come. And for the first time in years, Thomas Mitchell could finally say he was home.